So I wanted to give a little bit broader view of information security incident response. The outline that the textbook goes through um, is pretty basic, and there are lots of other guides out there, and I really want to highlight at least two here. They're not required reading, but if you're interested in security management, both of these are worthwhile. The first is the NIST Guide for Security Incident Handling. And essentially, it has these five steps. You have to have a plan, right? Government agencies in particular have to have a plan. The plan has to include incident handling and reporting, and those two things are separated. The guide has to include some kind of communication with outside parties rather than just internal communication within the government. And you have to have a formal incident response team identified, including management for well-defined services. Finally, you have to have a security incident response training on a regular basis because turnover on the team requires regular training. You can't just wait for incidents to use that as an opportunity to train. Also, cloud.gov has a security incident response guide that is pretty mature and worth reading. So don't just take the plan that's laid out in the textbook and also in the next couple of slides for incident response as the only option. All right. So the textbook does talk about security incident response in some detail. This is separate from a continuity plan. You want them separate because an incident may or may not actually require enacting the continuity plan and vice versa. So a good example of this, your long-term continuity plan might have been triggered by something like the coronavirus, but that doesn't necessarily mean you had a security incident, and doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go through all the steps of your incident response. So we are separating continuity planning from incident response. Okay, but what is incident response? Well, essentially, anytime you have a documentable security incident, this is what tells the staff how to deal with that incident, right? Anytime you know for sure it's a security problem, this is how staff should respond. Now, different from a continuity plan, the goal here is really handling the incident without regard to business issues. If you start bringing business concerns into the decision-making for incident response, almost always you end up with problems that are both business-related, long-term business-related problems, and short-term security-related issues. So your incident response plan instead should define what constitutes a security incident very clearly, identify who's responsible for taking charge, and then describing a very basic plan of action to address this. Most of the time, that plan of action is not going to be influenced by business concerns. The first piece of that, though, is the who should be responsible, and that's typically your incident response team. The director is the person who's going to be in charge of all incident response decisions and what actions to take. The technicians, these are people who are performing the technical part of the response or the engineering part of the response. And the advisors, these are the people who will be looking at legal issues, human resource issues, public relations issues, as appropriate. And typically, you're going to have some communication between technicians and advisors in all of those phases, right? Legal, human resources, and public relations. Usually, when you're defining an incident response team, you're going to have to look at a minimum at legal concerns, including preserving evidence, record-keeping concerns, and this is both for a legal sense. We want to have documents on record for any potential legal proceeding after the fact, but also for your own edification, for your own ability to learn from the mistakes, learn from the incident, whatever it might be in the future. You have to have good records of what's happening and when it's happening. And then finally, public relations. You really want to include public relations in part because your stakeholders may actually have some role in helping you address this ongoing incident. And then finally, I'll just add again, you should really have a clear backup strategy for people serving in these roles. Backups is not just something that you want to do with data. It's something that you have to have in place in terms of redundancy. If you only have one human being in the world that can serve as your director, and they have gallbladder surgery or something when you have an information security incident, figuring out who should replace them at the time of the incident is just a terrible plan. So a clear line of succession backup strategy for all of the important roles in an incident response team is very, very important. All right, so a computer security incident response team is a team that's trained, authorized, and set up specifically to handle security incidents. These are not just teams that become active when you magically discover a threat. They're always active. They're always in charge of evaluating security reports and attempting to identify and address the things found in that report, including whether or not they have actually found a legitimate incident, some problem that needs to be addressed by triggering the incident response team broadly. So this includes reporting requirements, making sure that you've received that every incident that has been reported on the marketplace is being reviewed as appropriate by the team, and if necessary, forwarded to senior management as a possible concern that your organization would need to deal with. Detection, making sure that you have people who are actually looking to see, based on logs, based on your current data, whether or not you are subject to something that's been reported or even something that has not yet been reported. Triage, basically identifying what is an urgent need and then addressing it. Sometimes this includes prioritizing against a list of possible needs, all of which may be urgent, and figuring out which one is the most urgent and deserving of the most immediate action. Response, the security incident response team is, of course, interested in responding to these kinds of events in a coordinated fashion. And that includes not just the technical piece, but all aspects that are appropriate for both severity and time. And then postmortem, so the security incident response team does not just have responsibility for dealing with something that is time sensitive or urgent in some way. Often after the incident is over, you have to have the security incident response team review what's happening and then use that information to feed back into future responses so that you're more effective in the future. And then finally, education. This is essentially the responsibility of the incident response team to take the things that they have learned about good security practices and make sure that it's disseminated to everybody in the organization at the appropriate level, so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. We want to learn from an incident and not repeat that incident. It's a very important part of the process that unless you actually identify it, document it, and build it into your incident response team, you're not going to do it. It just won't happen naturally. Skills. Who are the people who should be included on these teams? Well, they need to be people who can collect, analyze, and preserve digital evidence, right? So there's a little bit of a legal aspect to this, but you can train technical folks as long as they're made aware of all of the things that are necessary for preserving digital evidence to do it. You need people who have analytical mindset and can look at data and infer trends from data and identify what is a critically important urgent need versus what is something that's concerning ongoing activity, and then respond appropriately. You need people who can identify the source of an incident or the impact, the business impact in particular of an incident. Sometimes the structure of malicious incidents, right, including the code. So this is just with these three skills, I think you could see that they're highly technical in nature. You need to have this very strong technical background, but when we start getting to the later skills, you'll also see that you have to have good organizational business skills and a bit of a legal understanding as well. So the incident response team needs to have people on it that can help manage the installation, manage the network as things are being rolled out. Potentially some folks who can perform penetration testing, vulnerability analysis. That kind of depends on the size of your organization. I don't think penetration testing and vulnerability analysis have to be done independently in every single organization. A lot of people will hire out contractors to do that sort of work, especially if you're a smaller organization. But you also need people who understand current trends and technologies that are being used for attacks, because these sorts of things do have a fashion to them. There are fads, and information security attacks become more popular versus less popular. And it's sometimes difficult to keep track of that if you don't have someone who's explicitly assigned to making sure that they're looking at the latest and greatest in trends and attacks. So this is a very difficult job. Hiring for it is really tricky, and it's one that will probably never actually be compensated appropriately. Because if things are good, what are they actually getting for the money? Meaning, what is your organization actually getting by hiring really talented people? And if things are bad, the stress is crazy intense and very, very difficult because there's lots of stuff to deal with all at once. And it can be a very, very intense job. So I don't think compensation is ever really going to be appropriate for an incident response team, but it is kind of unique. There are very few jobs out there with especially when there is a major incident, very few jobs that have that kind of an adrenaline rush of like, oh wow, this is happening right now. We've got to deal with it. So a lot of people are attracted to this as a career path because of that.